Rabbi Herschel Fogelman, Alav Shalom, from Worcester, tells a sweet story with the Rebbe, Azisa Maisa. He went on shlichus to Worcester, Massachusetts, I think during the Frierdiker Rebbe's lifetime, Kvayachol. And he didn't have it easy. There was misnagdon lemineim, there was much conflict. And he suffered a lot. He suffered a lot. He didn't just suffer a lot, he suffered for a long time, you know. So he tells the following story, that on one occasion he came to the Rebbe. I'm not certain what practical end he was after, but he was certainly complaining that, vifel the shir, as they say, how much is a person going to suffer? So the Rebbe said to him in Yechidus, I'll tell you a story. What was the story the Rebbe told him? That Rabbi Yonis in Eibishitz was a Makur of Lamalchus. Rabbi Yonis in Eibishitz was close to the king of whatever country he lived in. And he was a big pikeach. He was, besides being a gon and a chassid and a tzaddik, he was a big pikeach. He was a very smart man. And he held his own, as they say, under all kinds of conditions. He comes to the palace once. There's a big tumult, and it's about him. What's the tumult? How come the king favors a Jew, a Yidel, over everybody else? So it's a whole discussion about how they should resolve this dilemma. And they decided that they're going to make a cockfight, a fight of chickens, of roosters. Everyone is going to bring a chicken. And whoever's going to get from one end of the pen to the opposite end of the pen first, that the owner of that chicken will be the king's favorite. So all of these various officers who were vying for first place, for first position, brought these very large chickens. And Rabbi Yonis came with a little tiny hen, a nebuchadnezzar, barely alive. They put all these chickens into this pen, and immediately they were fighting with each other. This little bird couldn't fight with anybody, so it very, very, very gingerly strutted to the opposite side, and they got there ahead of everybody else, and that was the end of the story. And this is what the Rebbe told Rabbi Fogelman, you know. There's all kinds of conflict. The little chicken will get to the end. And that's exactly how it played out in Worcester. That's exactly how it played out in Worcester. The little bird survived everything, and the moistus of the Rebbe are still there. They've changed over time because the demographics have changed, but the Rebbe's presence in Worcester, as in many other places, where for many, many years Chabad had significant conflict. What's all that's left is Chabad in many places. The little bird made it to the other end. This is the story. My point is that there are so many examples in history, in Torah, in Jewish history, in Torah, where it's not the biggest player that's the most successful. It's not necessarily the one who you think has the greatest bracha, the most geschickt, with the most skill and the most talent, even the most tzidkes, the most righteousness, is the one that sees it through with success. Very, very, very often it's the lesser player that turns out to be successful, and the greater player, it just doesn't happen. Sometimes it's tragic. Sometimes you feel almost like, you wish history would have been different. And it's unfortunate that it played out this way. But, like the famous word of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was talking to his friends about what they would do if they were God, if they were the Rabbi Shalom, and the Alter Rebbe said, as ich wollte gewinnt der Rabbi Shalom, wollte getan, Punkt, wo der Rabbi Shalom tut, had I been the Rabbi Shalom, I would do precisely as the Rabbi Shalom does. And there are many, many examples for this, where it isn't necessarily the person or the attitude that seems to be the strongest at the outset that carries through. Sometimes it's something less. An example with David HaMelech. David HaMelech was an outcast in his own home. He was less. And he was David Melech Chavakayim. When you compare David and Shaul, the way Chassidus explains it, Shaul is on a much, much higher level than David HaMelech, and yet David HaMelech is Chai V'Kayim, he's eternal. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi, the one who wrote the Mishnayos, was the Talmud of Reb Meir, but he wasn't in the first seat. The Gemara says that they used to stand in rows, in circles. And the Rebbe would sit and the Talmidim would stand. The Rebbe was in the first row, but he stood behind Reb Meir. And then the way they were positioned was the greatest Talmud had the first position, the second Talmud had the third position. Rebbe was behind Reb Meir, and yet he was the one who was Machabed the Mishnayos, not the Talmud standing closest to Reb Meir. And like I said, there's many examples, there's a lot of stories. And I suppose one of the most basic forms for this is, our good friend Tayu and Tikkun. Elam HaTayu and Elam HaTikkun. Tayu is greater than Tikkun. Tayu is stronger than Tikkun. It's more intense than Tikkun. It's more extreme than Tikkun. And it has a shvira. It collapses. It fails. Tikkun is weaker and softer, and it survives. Right? In terms of the Aveis HaElam, there's Yankov and Esav. Esav is Gevuda, is cautious. And he becomes Achzarius, becomes evil. Yankov Avinu is soft. And Yankov Avinu is Me'ein Shufrei, the Adam Arishan. And on and on and on and on. You can find many, many examples for this, where what appears to be the weaker or the lesser of a particular circumstance or a particular model, that is what survives and the stronger one doesn't. I'm thinking, we're coming from Parshas Shmini. This week is Tazria. Nadav and Avihu pass away. Nadav and Avihu are considered much greater than Elazar and Isamar. Or to use another example from Chumash, Eid and Oinan pass away, and what's left over is Sheila and Peretz and Zorach. Eid and Oinan are considered much greater. We don't understand what such neshamas mean, but the Eibishter created the world with the neshamas, so to speak, who are on the lower levels, because they're able to be a world. You learn in Chassidus about the world before the Mabul. The world before the Mabul, the way it's described in Chasal, in Torah, and Chassidus, is people, if they were righteous, they were holier than any of the tzaddikim that lived later. But if they were evil, they were far more evil than any of the Rishonim that would live later. And from that world, there's a churban, there's nothing, there's a Mabul. In other words, not only are the Rishonim not around, the tzaddikim are not around. Because mitzvah kevelt nishboy, and you can't build a world with such people. There's a story, which I've told before, which is in the Friedrich Rebbe Siches, about the Chassidishe city of Kremenchuk. Kremenchuk had a Rov, who was a Chassid, and a Gon Olam. He was a mind, if you can use these oisias, on the madreg of the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi. He was a Gan HaGoinim. His name was Rabbi Yosef Tamarkin. Rabbi Yosef Tamarkin was one of the three Rabbonim that presided on the Din Torah when the Tzemach Tzedek passed away between his sons. Rabbi Yosef Tamarkin, Peretz Chanin, and Schneur, Zalman, Fratkin, the Baal Mechaber Sefer Teras Chesed. They sat on the Din Torah of the Goinim, the Bnei Agon HaMechaber, the Tzemach Tzedek's children. Rabbi Yosef Tamarkin passed away very young. And he passed away quite suddenly, Tafresh Lamed Daled. I don't know exactly how old he was, but he wasn't 70. And he left a vacuum, left a chasm, left a massive, massive emptiness, vacuum in Kremenchuk. It took many people to fill a position that he held unilaterally, all by himself, because he was Agadol Amiti. His son-in-law became the Rav, and a number of different people did different things. One of the things that happened in Kremenchuk, Rabbi Yosef Tamarkin passed away, was that there became a need for a hashpah, for a nash. Kremenchuk was not exclusively a Chabad city, by no means. There were many, many Yidden, a small percentage or a significant percentage, but only a percentage were Lubavitchers, Chassidim, Chabad. And Rabbi Yosef Tamarkin, with all the other things that he did, also with Chazach Siddas, and he would make Fabrengens, and he would discuss in Yonim Pnimiyim. This task was left to the famous Kremenchuk Beralach. There's a niggin. The Kremenchuk Beralach have a niggin. There were 3 of them or 4 of them. The details of what happened to each of these Beralach, I don't remember at the moment. But there was Reb Meisha Ber, Masayev they called him, and there was Chaim Ber, his last name was Vilinsky. Chaim Ber was the youngest. When the Rebbe Tamarkin passed away, and the kibbutz of Anash, the community of Lubavitcher Chassidim, became the achrayus of the Bet Halach. So some of them obfuscated, one of them passed away or moved away. The Moshe Ber opened up a shul, and he began to create a kehila of anash, of Chabad Hasidim, and he was an extremist. He wasn't normal. And he insisted that the Chassidim that were under his hashpah should also live extreme life. I mean, one of the things that's written is that they should drink a lot of alcohol. And he created, I mean, you can imagine, a Chabad Hasidus, but it was almost like Tolkei Chassidim. It was very hysterical. Rabbi Chaim Ber couldn't take this. Rabbi Chaim Ber understood that this was wrong. Rabbi Chaim Ber was younger than him. Rabbi Chaim Ber, I don't know who was a bigger person, but he knew that this was incorrect. So Rabbi Chaim Ber opened up a second shul, a Chabad shul. And the Moshe Ber would never forgive him. It became very personal. Rabbi Chaim Ber had no grudge against the Moshe Ber. He just understood that what the Moshe Ber was not sustainable, that you couldn't create a generation of Chassidim like this. But he loved and respected the Moshe Ber. He was his friend. He was older than him. So the story was that when people would come to Rabbi Chaim Ber and ask him for a tova, ask him for anything, he would say, "There's Tana Teva Moshe Ber. If you'll do a favor for Moshe Ber, who hated him, then I'll do you a favor." The Friedrich Rebbe said about this chassid of Chaim Ber Belensky, mit Chaim Ber, I mean, the Babich hat mir gesagt, als mit Chaim Ber hebt sich an ticken. With this chassid, Chaim Ber begins in Kremenchuk ticken, order, sustainable Yiddishkeit. The end of the story was that Chaim Ber passed away young. He passed away before the Moshe Ber. The Friedrich Rebbe knew him as a child. When Chaim Ber passed away, he left a real emptiness in Kremenchuk. The Moshe Ber was still doing his thing, but he had a very small following. And the Moshe Ber would have been so bitter that his former friend had opened up a second base on Medrash and he wouldn't forgive him for creating a competition and the whole thing. When he died, when Chaim Ber passed away, the Moshe Ber said in Yiddish, of course, "Ich habe gedacht sterben und er gedacht leben. Weil er wollte gelebt, weil der Welt gehabt hat no." He says, I should have passed away, he should have lived, because if he would have lived, the world would gain. In other words, the Moshe Ber ultimately knew the truth. That there's an old Yiddish expression, "Tzi teugnish." Anything which is too much is no good. Too smart is no good. Too rich is no good. Anything is no good. A little bit less than perfect, sometimes much more perfect than perfect itself. We have a little tiny Maamar to learn, right? It's in one PDF. It's in one Word document for both Maamarim, Likkutei Torah and Olam Liechsadra. This Maamar is actually even shorter than the previous one. It's all of 30 lines, 32 lines. It's a tiny Maamar. And it's the same idea as the Maamar we had before. If you remember the shir I gave last week. So what did I tell you? I'm just going to say one akudah from last week's Maamar, and then I'm going to move on. That normally when we speak about Zochar and Akeva, we think of it as Mashpia Makabel, giver and taker. So if Isha Ki Tazria, if it's Mashpia Makabel, so then one is higher, the Mashpia is higher, the Makabel is lower. So you have the classic insight, Ish Mazriya Tchei Ledes Nekeva, Isha Mazraz Tchei Ledes Zochar. But the Alter Rebbe doesn't do that here. Instead of the Alter Rebbe speaking of higher and lower, Mashpia Makabel, also speaking about Chesed and Gevura. Chesed and Gevura are the same. So the question becomes, if Ish is Chesed and Ish is Gevura, why is Ish Mazriya Tchei Ledes Nekeva? And Isha Mazraz Tchei Ledes Zochar? And the answer is, every person has a primary characteristic and a secondary characteristic. And their external influence is the secondary characteristic. Ish Mazriya Tchila, his secondary characteristic is feminine, so he's Ledes Nekeva. Isha Mazraz Tchili Ledes Zochar, Midas HaGevura, her secondary characteristic is Chesed, so her children are going to be Chesed. In other words, what's less turns out to be more. It's sustainable. It can exist. So the Maamar we're going to learn today is going to say the same idea using a Gemara. Instead of using the Pasuk, he's using a Gemara. The Gemara is Olam Liechsadra Hudaima. The world is compared to a porch. The northern side is closed. Right? There's a Gemara that says that the Eibishter made the world, and around the world they put a mechitza, a barrier, and above the northern sky there is no mechitza. So the reason that's brought in Chazal is Hashem makes a world and leaves it unfinished, and He challenges us to finish it. He challenges us to close up the hole that He left. And of course, the point is we're not able to do anything. The Eibush is the balabas of the world. The way he made the world is the way the world is, and so on and so forth. This is what the Gemara says. But in this Maimed, Alter Rebbe is going to explain this Gemara in light of the idea that I just mentioned about Chesed and Gevura. That something that's Be'etzem Chesed, you see as Gevura. Something which is Be'etzem Gevura, you see as Chesed. Like I told you last time in the previous Shir, that Azay Zokman, that the Rebbe said that the Rebbe Shver, the Friedrich Rebbe, was inside Gevura, so he was outside Chesed. And I am inside Chesed, B'meila I can be outside Gevura. Something to that effect. And that's really the spirit of the Maimah we're about to learn. So I'm going to talk a little bit, okay? Before we read, I'm going to talk, I'm going to fabreng, I'm going to schmooze, I'm going to give you a number of different forms for this insight, okay? The first is Tanya. Sharayich Ramuna Perik Vav. The 6th chapter of Shayach Ramuna, the Alter Rebbe brings the pasuk that says, Olam Chesed Yibana. Olam Chesed Yibana means that when the Eibishter created the world, he created with Midas HaChesed. And Alter Rebbe interprets. Olam means Helam. Olam means concealment. Olam means Elakim, concealment. Olam Chesed Yibana, when the Eibishter created the world with, in a way of Gevura, in a way of concealment, there was an act of kindness. And Alter Rebbe's point is that it has to do with his Hiskalalus. But I'm going to leave the Hiskalalus alone, it's not for us. But Olam Chesed Yibana means Gevura. And the Olam, which is Gevura, Chesed Gibana, is a symptom of kindness. Why? Because the Eibishter makes a world where godliness is not concealed, so there's no free will, there's no independence from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a continuation of the Eibishter and not a world that can serve him. So Hashem's concealing himself is a kindness. And that's the kind of a concept that this Maimah is going to underscore, that something that is in the inside Gevura, you see it's Chesed, and something that is in the inside Chesed, all you see is Gevura. Okay, for example, this is an example. There's a Maimah from the Alter Rebbe, which Alter Rebbe wrote, Korav was Manas Talkus. We don't know exactly when, but near the Histalkus, Alter Rebbe wrote this himself. The Alter Rebbe Beklau wrote Nigla, right? Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Tshuvas. And he wrote the Tanya, of course, but Maimarim, Rubam Kekulam, the majority of Maimarim of the Alter Rebbe were said, and the Chassidim wrote it down. G'dei Chassidus wrote it down. But this page Alter Rebbe wrote, and it's printed in the Igris Kedesh, amongst Alter Rebbe's letters. It's one page, and it's called HaNefesh HaShvela. It's talking about a neshama that comes into this world, and the purpose of this world, and the purpose of neshama in this world, and so on and so forth. And this little Maimer revolves around the famous Medrash, based on the pasuk Chesed ve'emes nivgashu. Kindness and truth met. Kindness and truth met. Emes Amar Al Yivra, the truth says don't create a world. Chesed Amar Yivra, kindness said to create a world. Why did the truth say don't create a world? Because as far as Midas Emes is concerned, no one is going to be good enough. Hey Nashamayim Lizachu Be'elav. V'gam b'malach of Yasim Ta'ala, nobody is good enough at the Eibishter. So Midas Emes says they're going to be a disappointment, don't do it. Chesed Amar Yivra, Chesed knows that people are not going to be perfect. But what they do is going to be real. And the Alter Rebbe discusses the idea of Chesed She'en Shalemes, that the world was created for acts of kindness. And the fact that it's important for the action to be done is so preeminent that even if the action is sheker, Chesed She'en Shalemes, you're doing it because of self-interest. The bottom line is Chesed, that's the Kavanah Sabriya. That's what Midas HaChesed says. And Midas Emes is going to scream and shout, this is self-serving, this is disingenuous, it's not L'Shem Shamayim, it's for the sake of self, etc., etc., etc. And Chesed is going to say, but the Chesed was done. Or to say it in fancy words, Emes says, don't create the world, and Chesed says that Emes, La Mite says, the absolute truth says, that whatever motivation a person has for doing an act of kindness, a person did an act of kindness, that's why the Eibishter created the world. Or to say it differently, the false kindness is the reason the world exists. True exactitude, it's true and it's right, but it's just going to destroy the world. Nothing is good enough. Like you have the Chassidus that nowadays you have to paskin like Beis Hill, not like Beis Shammai. After Mashiach comes, the world is on a higher level. If you paskin today like Beis Shammai, they destroy the world. The Eibishter wants that the world should be. What if the world is not so perfect? It's the most perfect thing is that an imperfect world should exist. So the point is that the lower and weaker midah often delivers the better and more sustainable purpose, which is that there should be a world that should have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and serve. That's my first thought in initiating the Maamar. One more. You have in Sefer Yetzirah, that there's 22 Hebrew letters, there's Gimel Oimos, Zayin Kfules, and Yud Beis Pshutos. And there's some discussion in Chassidus about it. But there are 7 midas. 7 midas. And then there are 12, what's called Yud Beis Gevulei Alachsan, the 12 edges of the diagonal lines. I think I spoke about it last week also. I did. What's the difference between the Zayin midas and Yud Beis Gevulei Alachsan? The difference is Zayin midas, 7 emotions in Atzilus, is Chesed by itself, Gevura by itself, Teferes by itself, Netzach by itself, Hoid by itself, Yesod by itself, and Machas by itself. Yud Beis Gevulei Alachsan means how each midah is balanced out or tempered or diminished by its counterpart, Chesed with Hoid, and Gevura with Netzach, and so forth. In other words, the 7 initial midas are what you would call Atzmiyim, they're very intense. But because they're so intense, they can't give anything out. Something which is infinite gives nothing out. You cannot take something from infinity. Infinity is not divisible. But when something is dilute, something is less, because it's been balanced out by an opposite midah, so it's finite. So from finitude, from something which is gavul, you can extract something. So the way it would play out in Chassidus is that the 7 midas are higher level. The Yud Beis Gevulei Alachsan, the 12 edges of the diagonal lines, are a much lower level, but they reveal themselves, they show themselves, they give the world. And the argument would be that the diminished midas that are dilute, because they incorporate into themselves an opposite or a counterpart, has far more credibility, far more usefulness, I should say, than the 7 absolute midas. They're much stronger, they're much greater, they're much higher. But to use a Yiddish expression, and you can't create a world with extremes. You can't create a world with principle. You have to create a world with compromise. Now the world has to have principle. But the greatest principle of the world is that the world should be. And if you need to compromise principle to sustain the principle that there needs to be a world, that becomes the most principled thing. And that's called chitzonius. That's called secondary characteristics, as opposed to primary characteristics. So the Torah tells us in Chumash, Isha ki Tazria v'yolda zochar. A woman is inyan is gevura, whatever the reasons are. Her children are chesed. Why? Because she has chesed, and the chesed that she has is less than the gevura that she has. But it's the midas pashetas. It's what you see on the outside. And you can say, wait a minute, you're not getting the real depth of the person. It's true you're not getting the real depth of the person, but at least you have a person. If you get the real depth of the person, there won't be any children. Ishki Tazria v'yolad, that she'll have a daughter, because the primary midah of Ish is chesed, and if he would give out the midas chesed, there'd be no children, it'd be too intense. But from his secondary characteristic, from Gura, you can have an Akev, you can have a daughter. So we can have the same Maamar again, this time not using psukim, but using a Gemara. What does the Gemara say? Let's go to the text, line 54. I put the 2 Maamarim into one contiguous word. And Mr. will be up online by the Maamar, you'll be able to see it inside. Olam Liechsadra, but the whole world is comparable to a porch. In other words, not to a house, which is closed in on all 4 sides, but to a porch which was closed at the back and closed on either side and open towards the street. Of the 4 sides, the direction of north is not closed in b'mechitza. And of course, again, I mentioned to you earlier how the Chazal explained why the Eibishter does it. Our Maamar is going to ask the question, so the Eibishter leaves part of his world open to demonstrate to us that we're incapable of completing what he starts. Only he can be a creator. But the question is, why is the northern sky open rather than the southern sky or the eastern sky and the western sky? And that's the question which we're now going to address. Let's go. Hine. Says the Rebbe, Bedarim hu tekef achem. In the south it's very, very hot. Those who live in the south are dark-skinned. They don't have the same kind of successful civilizations and habitations that exist in the north. It almost seems a fact that people who live in northern latitudes, whether you're living in Europe or you're living in America, seem to be doing better than those who are living in the southern latitudes. Now, of course, there is above the equator and below the equator, but in general, when you're closer to the North Pole, there seems to be greater bracha, and the further you go away, it seems to be less bracha. Those who live in the north are fair-skinned. That's the place where most of the 70 nations have found not just life, but habitation and success. And the question is why? Why is it that if you live in the north, you have greater success? If you live in the south, there seems to be a tendency towards a harder life. The civilizations, the communities, the cultures, the lands seem to be less blessed than those who are living in the north. Why is it? Now, of course, the reason this is particularly problematic is because north and south is left and right. The north would be the left side and the south would be the right side. And we usually presume that right is greater than left, and in this case it's the other way around. That the north, which represents the left, is far more blessed than the south, which represents the right. Look inside. The south is chesed. And the north is gevura. As the pasuk says, first of all, he brings the pasuk mitzafan to pasuk haro. There's a pasuk in Tanakh that from tzafan comes all the tzaras. And then he uses Yossi of Teresh Baal Peh, which is emes. It's also psukim mizrach nikraponim kedma umaydav acher. The east is called the face and forward, and the west is called the rear. No? So if you're facing east, and that's the face, and behind you is the south, which is called acher, so then automatically to the right is going to be the south, and to the left is going to be the north. So you have v'darim yamin, it's often smell. The south is the right, and the north is the left. So what's the question? The question is, arguably, what's the question? The darim should be better than tzafim. Darim is the right side, representing midas chesed. So how come it is that there seems to be less bracha in the south than there is in the north? And I want to add another detail, which I don't know how to resolve, but the Rebbe doesn't mention it in the Maamar, and that is that there's a Gemara that says, Hareitze laha ashir yatzpin, Hareitze lahachkim yadrim, v'simnach shulchan b'tzafan u'menei v'dam. He says, if you want to make a lot of money, go to the north. If you want to be very smart, go to the south. And the remez is because in the Beis HaMikdash, the shulchan, the table which represents Parnas, was on the left side, was on the northern side. And the menorah, which represents wisdom and light, and Torah was on the right side, which was the south side. So here, in this framework, we're saying something very favorable about Darim, but not in our mind. Our mind seems to argue that the further down you go, the more southern you go, the more troubled the yishuv is. And the question is why? So the Rebbe immediately answers the question, line 60, even though we all know the reason. Because chesed du gevura miskalalim zemizeh. There is no such thing as a pure midah. Pure chesed is infinite, and therefore, for all intents and purposes, not existent. Pure gevura is infinite, and for all intents and purposes, not existent. The reason there's a chesed mispashetes. Chesed mispashet and a gevura mispashetes is because the chesed is qualified by gevura, and the gevura is qualified by chesed. Gevura sheba chesed, v'chesed sheba gevura. And what our Maamar is going to argue is that it's the secondary characteristic that dominates. And the north take is gevura, so its secondary characteristic is chesed, so that's why from the north you have chesed. Darim is chesed, its secondary characteristic is gevura, and that's why in the south you see less bracha. And therefore, hadarim shu chesed, the south, which is kind, yesh be gevura, has to have externally exactitude, preciseness. Since it's mida atzmis, they was going to call it tzafan atzmei and darim atzmei. The mida of darim as it is by itself is chesed. But the mida of darim, which is chesed, is by itself is an atzmis midah. It's a midah without an expression. It has a secondary characteristic of gevura, and this secondary characteristic of gevura is the reason why in darim there's less success in the yishuv. Because this gevura is tekef achem. That's why it's very, very hot. And part of the reason why in the south it's so hot is for the following reason. And the Rebbe is going to now explain the Gemara. The Eibishter created a world, and the world is surrounded by walls. My nefesh habahamis, my yetzer hara, my superficial thinker wants to say that this is ozone. But whatever it is, the Chazal say that the world is surrounded on three sides by walls, which means everything is contained. And on the north, it's open. The Rebbe says the fact that the southern sky is surrounded by walls focuses and concentrates the sun's light. It limits it. Let's read it inside. The reason why in the south it's so hot is because we see, I'm on line 63 now, we see the very presence of the sky, or the box that contains the life, light, and energy of this world, on the southern sky is contained by the rakia, by the walls of the heaven, so to speak, that encompasses the world. That prevents and holds back. It doesn't allow the sun's rays to go everywhere. The argument that the Rebbe is putting forth is that the sun's light shines. If the sun's light is free to go every place else, it'll thin out in its distribution. It'll thin out, won't be too hot. But if you hold the sun's rays in a place because there's a mechitza, there's no place to go, so it's very concentrated. And the effect of that concentration is that it becomes impossibly hot. And that's what the Rebbe is describing here. Says the Rebbe, it prevents and it holds back that the sun's light in the southern sky is not allowed, is prevented from being mispashit b'chol in the whole world. And instead, it shines where it's directed to shine, and because it can't be thinned out, it shines with great intensity, and the effect of that is that it can, so to speak, burn up the world. This containment is rooted in gevuras hamakbilim, that limit, and then the Rebbe adds gevuras. And the effect of this is that it becomes impossibly hot. It affects the brain, it affects the ability to reason, it affects the ability to build civilizations, and so on. The south represents in its essence chesed. In other words, chesed on a level of bli gevul, and chesed on a level of bli gevul is effectively, or in effect, chesed, which is not emergent, it's not coming out. It has to include also gevura, which contains. And all you see from the midah atzmis of chesed is its gevura. And it shows itself in the sun's light being held in one place, which makes it unbearably hot, impossibly hot. Line 68, Aval B'Tzofin, as opposed to in the north. Sha'atzme gevura. The northern sky is the other way around. Its basic nature is gevura. And of course, if chesed by itself is not very generous, is not very forthcoming because it's an atzmi kamida, gevura by itself is certainly not very generous, but niskal b'chesed, okay, niskal b'chesed also chesed, which is a secondary characteristic, and that's why you see chesed. So everything is backwards. What you are b'yetzem shows itself in your hispashtus inversely. What people see in your hispashtus inversely is the opposite of what you are b'yetzem. And sometimes the people who b'yetzem on a higher madrege, when it comes into the real world, they're not very helpful, useful. Sometimes people who are spiritual on a much lower madrege, when it comes into the real world, they're very, very helpful. And that's the discussion we're having. And accordingly, hukar, the northern sky is cold, and of course the Rebbe is not comparing the North Pole with the South Pole, because the South Pole, Antarctica, is not a Makam Yishuv. Nobody lives there. But in the northern latitudes, people live much, much closer to the North Pole than people live to the South Pole, because it's land and it's sea and whatever, it's broken up intermittently and so forth and so on, and it's cold. And this coldness is even from Chesed. The coldness means a tempering of the otherwise intense midas gevura. Gevura would be very exact and very hot. Chesed diminishes that. But at the same time, the gevura does have an influence in the north as well, which is why you have tekef akridus amagadu makrish. And I'm going to add a word which is sinful, but I'm going to add it. Sometimes, not always, sometimes, when the cold is preeminent or predominant, it becomes so cold, everything becomes stiff, everything becomes hard, everything becomes fixed. Because what you're seeing is gevura is atmis the kamida showing itself. In the northern latitudes, you have midas achesed, they be just kind. Because the gevura is atzmi is diksa, you cannot see it. Which is why in the northern skies, in the northern latitudes, there's greater success, there's greater community, because there's much more kindness and softness. And the midas gevura, this is the etzem, which is not mispashet. But sometimes when it's very, very cold, that's for the gevura of the north. Turn the page, line 7, and therefore meaning what? Therefore, once we understand that every midah has a secondary counterbalance opposite midah. And you only see the secondary counterbalance opposite. You don't see the primary midah. Lachain, therefore, yeshmayim b'tzafim. The northern latitudes are defined by water, because water represents kindness. Now, of course, when I was reading this and preparing the class, what did I think automatically? That the opposite of the northern sky would be the Antarctica, which is a landmass, right? Why is the South Pole so much colder than the North Pole? The answer is there's no water. It's a desert. It's a mountain. It's a desert. The North Pole is water, and the water results in the fact that the environment, the temperature will be much, much warmer. And perhaps when the Rebbe said, pure gevura, maybe that's the South Pole, but I don't know. I'm just babbling on. But the basic issue that the Maamar is making is that each environment shows you its secondary characteristic, and that's how it's defined. So the north, which is gevura, shows you its secondary characteristic, which is chesed, and that's where most people lived in. That's where there's the most successful communities and so forth. But that's why there's moisture in the north. And water comes from chokhmah, which is mekedach, so the real source of kindness. It's called the sea of chokhmah. In other words, keach or makar aleichos, it's the energy and root of moisture, which is b'meich, which is in the mind. Mekedach is living the source of the passions of the heart. B'dishpei eish, of fire attached to a coal, and as the pasuk says, "Ani bina li gevura," that from bina comes gevura, but from chokhmah comes chesed, and the midas ha-chokhmah in the northern sky, in the northern latitudes, the northern sky, causes that you should see my kindness. But the midas ha-chesed in the northern sky is the secondary characteristic. The primary characteristic is gevura, and you don't see it. Mashenkim daram, as opposed to in the southern latitudes, you have Asia, everything is very dry. You have desert, right? You have all kinds of desert. You have deserts where it's very hot. You can also have deserts. Some of the driest places on earth are covered with snow, but it almost never rains. There's no precipitation. And then the Rabbi, the southern sky does have, the southern latitudes do have rivers, because there's a skal, chesed, and gevura. How this is going to play out in the conversation that we're having now, I don't know. But that's nevertheless what the Rebbe says. So the point is that the part of the world which is defined by gevura gives us great kindness, and the part of the world which is defined by great kindness, it turns out to give us much more gevura, because the primary characteristic is so intense, and the secondary characteristic reveals itself in an inverse way. The opposite of your primary midah is your secondary midah. Line 75, Gan Eden. What about Gan Eden, which is in the middle of B'kava Yasher? It's the middle pole. It's fundamentally chesed, but it also has gevura, but it's balanced. In other words, Gan Eden is in between these two extremes of chesed and gevura, and therefore it's not only noite klape chesed, like it is in the northern sky versus the southern sky, but it's chemes be'emes. In other words, we are arguing that you shouldn't concern yourself with emes amar al yivra. Just concern yourself with chesed abba yivra, right? Don't worry about the fact that the meat of emes says the world is unsustainable. Worry about kindness as the world is sustainable. Because in the real world, the only thing that matters, there should be a world. And that world should do goodness, even if the goodness is not entirely l'shem shamayim. And that's emes la'amite. But in Gan Eden, it's not that way. In Gan Eden, the gevura also is interested in creating a world, because Gan Eden is a perfect environment. That's what the Rebbe says in this line, Akav b'shava, atzmuch sadim, and nevertheless there's also gevuras. And it's balanced correctly. But in the rest of the world, above Gan Eden and below Gan Eden, if your primary midah is gevura, you see chesed. If your primary midah is chesed, you see gevura. And dafka, the environment where you see the chesed on the outside, that's the sustainable environment. That's the lasting environment. This is what we said, that we associate heat with gevura and cold with kindness. Is also chiluf. It's also by interchanging and replacing, because I guess because by itself, kridos could be gvura and chaim could be chesed. Shai, this is the Maamar, right? That's basically the Maamar. And then the Rebbe says, klal of the mills. The point is, shazau ikar hatikun. The Eibishter created a world that it should be, not that it should be destroyed. You think about government. I guess I'll say it the way it is. I was raised by an immigrant My father should live and be well. Tevis was born in Moscow. And for the first 15 years of his life, he lived through Gehenna on earth in an unimaginable way. Came to this country as a 15-year-old Bacharol after living in Moscow and in Tashkent and in Siberia and then traveling all over Eastern and Western Europe. Finally came to the United States of America. So a person like my father, Zalman Gezud, loves America. He loves America very, very much. Perhaps more than I do. Not perhaps, for sure. Any person who's an immigrant has a soft spot. And he talks about Americans' ability to be kind. And Americans' ability to be kind doesn't come from their principle. It comes from their freedom. It doesn't come from their strength. It comes from their softness. And this is what the Eibishter wanted. I started to say before. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, "Havei mispal b'shlei mishal malchus shel molam eiro ish yisrei v'chaim bloi." You have a government, right? Which government isn't corrupt? So you're going to point it out? A government is corrupt. You're going to point it out. Who are you going to hurt? A person is corrupt. A person in a position of power. You're going to point it out. Who are you going to hurt? Yeah, what about principle? What about righteousness? And the answer is the principle is there should be a world. And the principle that there be a world is more important than the principle that has all governance and sent or whatever it is. And this is a yesoid. It's how Hashem made the world. Hashem, to me, government is one of the most amazing things. It's the maximally inefficient system in the world. And yet, I remember many years ago I bought a house, my wife and I bought a house. And he come in the morning and the garbage was taken. Big deal. Who thinks twice about it? It's a nes min hashamayim. How many things have to go right for the garbage to be collected? And it's being collected by the government, which means that there's a lot of inefficiency and there's a lot of wasted money and a lot of people sleeping on the job. But it gets done. That's what the Eibishter wanted. This is a Vayna Welt. And when you start getting caught up in prosecuting every criminal, everybody who wastes 5 minutes, you have to charge him for the time that he wastes. You destroy the civilization. Now, there's no justification for ineptitude and for inefficiency and for corruption. But the worst thing is that you stand on principle, and in standing on principle, you create a churban. That's what Elam HaToyu is. And that's what the Rebbe is trying to teach us in this Maamar, and in the Maamar Likkutei Torah. What you see, the sustainable world is by definition dilute. Because the world which is principled and absolute is self-destructive in its principle, in its ikaron. And the same is true in this Gemara, just like in the Pasuk. Ruach Tzvein is psucha, Midas HaGvura is open. And that's why Midas HaGvura works. You'll see inside momentarily. But let's read the most important part of the Maamar, line 78. This little paragraph here, this is, so to speak, the point. Klola the Milsa, the principle is this. Shazeho Iker HaTikun. This is the primary insight into Tikkun. Tikkun means order. Tikkun means perfection, actually. Exactitude. But Tikkun, more than anything else, means Ezol Zayin Avel. There should be a world. Like the story that the Chaim Ber, that the Rebbe Rayat says. Chaim Ber was a smaller chassid than a Meshach Messiah. His followers were not on the same madrega as the followers of Meshach Messiah, but they had wives whom they respected and looked after. They had children whom they raised. They built kehilas. Less than perfect, but less than perfect is more perfect than perfect, because perfect is a system which is going to burn itself down. And that's what Tikkun ultimately means, that there should be a world. Shetikkun amaitli is barach, the Eibishter gave order to his world. Li is eid of chesed begavura, gura b'chesed. You have to blend chesed with gavura and gavura with chesed. Kadesh yiskayim ha'el, the world should be able to be sustained. V'zula is otherwise lo yehoya kiyam leilam klal, the world has no existence. We had a story years ago in yeshiva where someone had written on the blackboard the churban of our times. I'm not going to go into all the particulars. Is because people are not principled. So someone took a marker and crossed out the word not. The churban of the time is because people are principled. Everything you have to fight about. There's a right and a wrong. But the greatest right is that there should be peace. Some things you have to fight for. But you have to think so many times before you start a fight, because it's not about winning. It's about living, it's about sustaining, it's about ticking. So the Rebbe says the Eibishter creates every chesed with gvura, every gvura with chesed, and to be sure, what you see is the opposite midah. It's not just that you blend chesed and gvura, but a midah which is chesed atzme, you see gvura. A midah which is gvura atzme, you see chesed. And the Rebbe says this is why the northern latitudes are more successful than the southern latitudes. The northern latitudes represent midas hagavura, but they show you chesed. The southern latitudes represent midas chesed, but they show you gvura. Ki im hatzofen shu gvura be'etzem, if the northern latitudes, which represents gvura, would show that gvura is by itself lo chesed klal, there be no kindness, lo miskayim. Everything would be wrong. Everybody would be dishonest. Everybody would be punished. It would be impossible. Principle. But principle is very destructive on occasion. It has to also have chesed. This, as we said in the Maamar of last week, that when a midas hagavura conceives, produces seed first, the offspring is kind. When midas chesed produces seed first, the offspring is exact, because the secondary characteristic is weaker, and what's weaker is tougher, is more sustainable, it can survive in the world. Now the Rebbe goes back to the Gemara and he says, this is the reason. Why did the Eibishter choose that the northern sky should be without a cover, without a container, if the Eibishter created the world? And he left it incomplete as a message to Kol Bo Yom, to all of mankind. I created a world. I didn't finish it. Show me that you can fix it. Of course, to demonstrate to us our inability to contribute to the Eibishter's creation. But why did he choose the northern sky to be open? And the teretz is the wall that, so to speak, holds in the sky, comes to midas hagvura. So in the southern sky, you have a lot of sunlight, but you have the midas hagvura, the container of the mechitzas of the rekia. So the sun is very concentrated, it becomes too hot, you can't live, you can't think. Says the Rebbe B'Tofen, in the northern sky, because there's no containment, the heat is dispersed, it's thinned out. This is why it's open, to allow the sun's light to be distributed in a far broader area, so that it's not too hot in any one spot. Which is why it's cooler. The sun's rays are free to go in all different places, so no place has got a focus of heat that's too much to bear, as opposed to in the south. So the Gemara, the Rebbe is explaining a Gemara. And he's explaining this Gemara to make the same argument we made last week. When we talked about the idea of Isha ki Tazria v'yolda zachar, that the Eibishter leaves the northern sky open because the northern sky represents Gevura, and the openness of the northern sky represents Chesed. The northern sky is blessed because it's, even though it's Gevura, and if the sun's rays would be contained, it would be extraordinarily hot. But by keeping it open, the sun's rays are distributed over a larger area, and it's cooler, and this allows for tikkun, allows for kiyam ha'el. That's the Maamar. We're done. Okay? And I want to finish with something. I taught this Maamar, yeah? I'm sitting here for about 45 minutes. The Maamar is 30 lines. And obviously, before I came to teach it, I sat down, I learned it through, and I prepared, and I thought about it. What would the Rebbe add to this? What would our Rebbe add to this conversation? The conversation that we're having here is saying this, that there's a primary midah and a secondary midah. The primary midah is too intense. A world cannot exist from the primary midah. The world can only exist in the secondary midah, because the secondary midah is weaker and softer, and therefore it's more tolerant, and therefore it's able to be tikkun, able to be a world. All of that is true, and it's logical, and we understand it. Right? The most successful leaders are not the people who fight with everybody. They're the people who forget and leave people alone. And the Gemara, I told you this many times, the Gemara says that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the people insisted on following the letter to the law. Now, why is that a bad thing? And the answer is, follow the letter to the law is called Midas Deim. And Apiteda, this Kefan on Midas Deim, Vasisa Yoshva Tev, Lefnimi Shurus Adin. The world exists because people say, take it, have it. It's right, it's wrong, it's exact. And the idea that everything has to be exact, because it's mine and it's not yours, is not helpful to the person who's being exact, and it's certainly not helpful to the civilization as a whole. The man told me many years ago that he was a divorcee. He was married a second time. He says in his first marriage, every time he and his wife had disagreement, he so regretted it. I was going to show my wife that she was wrong. Yeah, you were wrong and you destroyed your marriage. She was wrong and you destroyed your marriage. No. So how wise is that? Principle. Right and wrong. Right and wrong and stupid. The world exists. Because the greatest principle is that things should be sustained. The greatest principle is that things should be given an opportunity to develop, to become an entity, without picking away at it, and finding every chassadim that you destroyed before the chance to develop and grow up. So my question, what would the Rebbe add to this? Of course I don't know. But my guts are telling me that the Rebbe would add to this that this is not compromise. The way we're looking at it, we're saying like this. The primary midah is gevura. The world can't exist from gevura. The chesed comes from gevura, which is secondary. That's a sustainable midah. The primary midah is chesed. The world cannot exist from such a chesed. It's too extreme. The secondary midah is gevura. From this, the world can exist. What would the Rebbe say? The secondary midah is not less than the primary midah. It's more than the primary midah. For a variety of reasons. Number one, in tzimtzum you have atzmos. For more than one reason. In tzimtzum you have more atzmos than in giluyim. Number two, the thing which expresses the Eibishter, the deepest, is the ability to bring him to the lowest place. So when you have a midah which is weaker, and because that midah is weaker, that the world is able to exist, the real reason why the weaker midah is able to exist with the stronger midah cannot exist is because that's the Eibishter himself. It comes across as the weaker midah, but it has a take of atzmi. It has a power, has a strength, which comes from Atzmus and Hussein Salbarach. Okay, Mitzvah Hashem, next week we'll learn Nachamayim.